Under the new rules, this could be my first video to get canceled. So if you are seeing it, be sure to send it to a friend or family. George Stinney Jr. resided in Alcolu, South Carolina in 1944 with his family. Alcolu was a small mill town with segregated neighborhoods and limited interaction between white and black residents. On March 23, 1944, the bodies of Betty June Binnicker and Mary Emma Thames were discovered in a ditch on the African-American side of town. I'll tell you more about this coming up. This is KRT, Critical Race Theory. It's not the one they teach in law school, but the one banned in public schools. Before we get started, more super thanks to Tom Slick for his second super thanks. Now the rest of the story. In 1944, 14-year-old George Stinney lived in Alcolu, South Carolina, with his father, George Stinney Sr., mother, Amy, brother, Charles, who was 12, and sisters Catherine, 10, and Amy, who was 7. George's father worked at the town sawmill, and the family resided in company housing. Alcolu was a small working-class mill town where white and black neighborhoods were separated by railroad tracks. There were segregated schools and churches for white and black residents with limited interaction between them. Then on March 23, 1944, the bodies of Betty June Binnicker and Mary Ann Thames were found in a ditch on the African-American side of town after the girls failed to return home the night before. The girls had been beaten with a weapon, variously reported as a piece of blunt metal on a railroad spike. Binnicker and Thames both suffered severe blunt force trauma, resulting in penetration of both girls' skulls. According to a report by the medical examiner, these wounds had been inflicted by a blunt instrument with a round head about the size of a hammer. The medical examiner reported no evidence of sexual assault to the younger girl, though the genitalia of the older girl were slightly bruised. The girls were last seen riding their bicycles looking for flowers. As they passed the Stinney's property, they had asked George Stinney and his sister Amy if they knew where to find maypops, a local name for passion flowers. According to Amy, she was with Stinney at the time the police later established the murders occurred. According to an article reported by the wire services on March 24, 1944, the sheriff announced the arrest of George Junius and stated that the boy had confessed and led officers to a hidden piece of iron. George and his older brother, John, were arrested on suspicion of murdering the girls. John was released by police, but George was held in custody. He was not allowed to see his parents until after his trial and conviction. Move up to 1995. Stinney's 7th grade teacher, W.L. Hamilton, a black man, spoke in an interview with the Sumter Item about George. Hamilton claimed that he witnessed George Stinney killing the children and that Stinney had a knife. Stinney's sister, Amy Ruffner, disputed these allegations and confronted Hamilton, who admitted that someone paid him to make those statements before his death. Following Stinney's arrest, his father was fired from his job at the local sawmill, and the Stinney family had to immediately vacate their company housing. The family feared for their safety. Stinney's parents did not see him before the trial. He had no support during his 81-day confinement and trial. They moved him 50 miles away to Columbia due to the high risk of lynching. Stinney was questioned alone without his parents or an attorney. Although the Sixth Amendment guaranteed legal counsel, this was not routinely observed until the United States Supreme Court's 1963 ruling in Gideon v. Wainwright that explicitly required representation through the course of criminal proceedings. Stinney's trial, including jury selection, occurred on April 24, 1944. His court-appointed lawyer did not challenge the police officer's testimonies or Stinney's confession or the prosecution's conflicting versions of the confession. Only 3 witnesses were called by the prosecution, including the Reverend who discovered the girls' bodies and the doctors who conducted the autopsy. The defense did not present any witnesses, cross-examine the prosecution's witnesses, or mount a substantial defense. The trial lasted for only 2.5 hours. Over 1,000 white people filled the courtroom, while black Americans were barred from attending. Stinney faced an all-white jury, as African Americans were largely excluded from jury service at that time. After less than 10 minutes of deliberation, Stinney was found guilty and sentenced to death by electrocution. There's no trial transcript, and no appeal was filed by his counsel. Despite appeals for clemency from Stinney's family, churches, and the NAACP, Governor Olin D. Johnston allowed the execution to proceed. Johnston visited Stinney 2 days before the execution and stated that Stinney had admitted to sexually assaulting and killing the girls. Stinney's parents were only permitted to see him once after the trial, as I said earlier, due to the threat of lynching. On the morning of June 16, 1944, at 7:30, Stinney was executed by electric chair. Because of his small size, a Bible was used as a booster seat. Stinney was restrained and offered the opportunity to speak, but remained silent. As the execution began, the face mask slipped off, revealing tears streaming down his face, although this account has been disputed. He was buried in an unmarked grave in Crowley. In 2004, local historian George Ferguson began researching the case of George Stinney after reading an article about it. Lawyers Steve McKenzie and Matt Burgess, along with others, contributed to the research and gathered evidence to support Stinney's exoneration. The Civil Rights and Restorative Justice Project at Northwestern University School of Law also supported the case and filed a brief in 2014. Ferguson and the lawyers sought relief through the Pardon and Parole Board and filed a motion for a new trial in 2013. They were optimistic about reopening the case and presenting evidence of Stinney's innocence, including a potential non-relative witness. Ferguson mentioned a deceased individual from a prominent white family as a possible culprit, and the CRRJ highlighted these findings in their amicus brief. Evidence strongly suggests that George Stinney was innocent of the crimes he was executed for in 1944. The prosecutor heavily relied on an unrecorded and unsigned confession from a 14-year-old who lacked proper legal representation and parental guidance. Stinney's defense lawyer failed to call witnesses who could have cleared his name or preserve his right to appeal. New evidence presented in a court hearing in January 2014 included testimonies from Stinney's siblings and an affidavit from Reverend Francis Baston, suggesting that the murders took place elsewhere. Another inmate, Wilford Johnny Hunter, testified that Stinney was coerced into confessing and maintained his innocence. The judge, Carmen Mullen, vacated Stinney's conviction on December 16, 2014, ruling that he did not receive a fair trial and that his Sixth Amendment rights were violated. She found his confession likely coerced and inadmissible and deemed the execution of a 14-year-old as cruel and unusual punishment. While acknowledging the possibility of Stinney's guilt, Judge Mullen criticized the lack of due process and insufficient defense provided to him during the trial, highlighting the urgency of rectifying this injustice. Then in January 2022, South Carolina State Representative Cesar McKnight introduced a bill named after Stinney titled the George Stinney Fund, which would make the state of South Carolina pay $10 million to the families of the wrongfully executed if their conviction is posthumously overturned. This has been Critical Race Theory. Please like and subscribe, leave a super thanks, or buy me a coffee, and share this video with your friends and family. I'll see you next time.